Hello and welcome to the Earth Science Associates video on the bidding forecast. This is a part of the GOM-Cube Analytics add-on and can be accessed through the GOM Smart website. This will be a deeper dive into the bidding forecast. We're going to go over the models and the data and some of the deeper intricacies of how the model works. So if you'd like just a briefer overview, check out one of the links in the description. There's two main parts of the forecast, bidding and MROV. In the bidding, we're going to be looking at which blocks are likely to be bid on, and then if they are bid on, what will that bid amount be? For MROV, we're going to take a look at which blocks are likely to have a minimum MROV, since the government does assign a minimum MROV often. And if they don't assign a minimum MROV, what will the MROV amount be? This forecast is limited to deep water only. We didn't want to mix up how the shallower waters work with the deeper waters, and most of the action's happening in the deep water anyways. We limit our study area to only things around where companies have an area of interest. So things way out in the frontier we do not make a forecast for. That's mainly because we don't have a lot of data out there, and so our forecast wouldn't be very accurate anyways. We looked at data all the way back from 1983 to get overall trends of how bidding works, but mostly our model focuses on data since 2009. We use a very purely statistical approach. This gives you nice, consistent, very objective results. There is no subjectivity put into our models or forecast. So it's a very non-biased approach. We get nice benchmarks, evaluation of outliers, and of course, with statistical models, you get nice measures of uncertainty. So you can see about how accurate we're being and judge for yourself on how much additional information you'd like to put into this. So an example of our output, as you can see, deep water only, and the red blocks are ones we think would be most likely to be bid on, and then goes orange, yellow, green, and then the blue would be blocks we think are unlikely to receive bids. We'll zoom in so you can see better what's going on there. So how do we make this prediction? Well, we look at a whole lot of variables, and that's one of the difficulties in this is gathering up all the data. And so some of our variables are global. That would include the price of oil, and the change in oil prices, how if it's going up or down, and the region. There's other local variables that are not specific to any particular company. And that would be things like the water depth, the EUR of the fields nearby, or the discoveries, how many wells there are, how far are you away from a platform, and is this block a first time available? Other local variables that are specific towards companies, and that would be how many current and past leases are in the area, was there drilling, and then relinquished, or was it undrilled and relinquished? Those tend to work a lot differently. Was the block rejected? Were there lost bids in the area? And then what were the bid amounts going on in that area? So our training model requires at least 3 years of data, but you can pick your training period. But we require 3 years just because we want to make sure there's enough data to make a valid model. The specific model is a logistic regression model. This is something that's used pretty commonly if you're looking at probabilities and you want to get an idea of something that's likely to happen. And then individual models are made for every single company, so you can actually see how much any particular company is contributing to the likelihood that a block receives a bid. And then, of course, we can combine all that into an overall probability that there will be at least one bid. After we do our training, this is a tornado plot of what our model looks like in a plot form anyways. And you can see on the left there are the explanatory variables. And this is for one particular company, and not all companies have all variables that are important to them. So if they don't meet a certain threshold, they're not considered for that model. But here at the very top, and you can see it has the largest influence, is relinquished undrilled leases. It's actually going to the left, so that negatively influences bidding. You're less likely to bid there. If you relinquished a lease and it was undrilled, this company is very unlikely to go back to it. But if you are in an area with very high bid amounts, you can see that goes to the right. It's also a very large bar, so that greatly increases the likelihood that this company will go and bid there. And then you can see that same thing happens for all the variables going down. Now some variables, the local variables anyways, we require a little bit of massaging here, and we're going to use a kernel density function. This isn't anything too crazy. It's basically just like a smoothing. And so with fields, for instance, so if we're looking at the EUR of nearby fields, right, most blocks don't have a field directly on them. And so since our model requires a value for every single block, we need to do a little bit of smoothing to actually get a value there. So this is how we do it. So you can see in the red there, I'm going to zoom in MC505, and you can see there's not a field directly on it, but there are some fields nearby. So we're going to get their center point, and then we're going to have a search distance, and you can see it's a little over 2 blocks as our search distance. And all those fields are then in our search distance, so they're going to contribute to the field EUR variable, for instance. And then you can see that the closer to the center is more red, indicating it's going to have a higher weight in 3D. And then you simply go out to the distance, go up to your kernel density function, and then the higher up you go, the more it contributes. If you're in the center, it contributes the most. And we sum them all up, and that's going to be our value for the field EUR in this particular case. So for all of our local variables, if you don't have a value directly on your, a lot of times you're not going to have a value directly on your field, so you're going to have to go out in the search distance and then smooth it out and get a value that way. Like I said earlier, the individual companies get a particular model made for them. And so here is a list of and again, we've sorted them by general 2 categories, high and medium activity, based on how many bids they're having and their money exposure. And so all of these get their individual models made. Notice in red, there is Noble, Stone, and Cobalt. As of making this video, they are no longer active in the Gulf. So for current forecasts moving forward, they do not contribute. And as companies either drop out or come in, we'll add them or remove them as needed from this analysis. Now, there are a lot of other smaller companies, some individual little companies. They are all treated as one single group. The idea being is that the bigger companies, they all have their own different bidding strategies and how they behave. And so the model can pick that out, and they can have different variables influence them differently. And so we want to just completely ignore all the other bidding. And so they do get grouped all into one single group. And then, of course, once we have all the individual models, like I said, we can aggregate it up into a probability that the block is bid on by at least one company. So the area of interest, like I said, we don't calculate things way on the frontier, mainly because we don't have good data. The specific way we calculate the area of interest is we looked at how far companies were bidding away from existing leases. And we found something fairly interesting is that almost always 95% of the bidding is within 2 blocks of a current lease. So we said, hey, let's limit it to that, and we're going to be able to take into account at least 95% of the bidding already. And so this AOI will change as the current leases change, so from sale to sale. And the other thing we always make sure is we include rejected blocks. So even if someone had a bid way out in the frontier and it was rejected, we also include that in our area of interest, mainly because we know that block is, maybe blocks in the area are likely to be bid on again. So for the bid, no bid probability cohorts, the way we come up with the colors is based on this spread of values you see here, A being the 5th percentile and then going down B, C, D, E. And so the top 5% of the cumulative probability, whatever blocks fall into that, get our A, which is our red color, and then it goes down from there. And so the A is always going to be those top most likely to receive bids. And so they should always focus on the ones that we think are most likely to receive a bid. The variables, some of them need a little bit of adjustment, and that's just because they wouldn't make sense since we're looking at historical data. So what ends up happening for bid amounts and MORV amounts, the minimum legal bid has changed. Currently, it's a little over $500,000 in deep water anyways. But that wasn't always the case, and so bids that were made earlier when the minimum legal bid was lower, it wouldn't really make sense to just keep it the same. So what we do is if your past bid amount was below the current legal minimum, it was changed to be the percentage above the legal minimum of the time. So for an example, $300,000 bid in 2010, the minimum legal bid was $216,000. Today we would treat that as $800,000 bid, and that's what goes into our training model. and that just keeps everything about a little more accurate to what we think would really be going on. So here's the result for bid or sale 253 again. You can see the reds. We can then put on the outline. The black outline is what actually received bid. And you can see this is not bad, pretty good. A lot of our reds, you can see this area, the reds and the orange did get bid on. Big kind of clump of blues, and that's, something that's fairly often happens is these blocks don't look of any particular interest to us in a general sense. And like I said, our model is a very it's like a third person or on the outside is looking at these blocks. Whatever company I'm sure bid on those did some particular individual analysis. They probably had some seismic data that we don't have, and that's why they're making bids like that. So we can't pick up everything, but so that's why you have to take everything into account like that. And we're not trying to replace individual analysis that companies are already doing. We're just trying to give them additional information so they can compare it and see if what they're coming up with makes sense from a an outside perspective, so to speak. Zoom in a little bit so you can get a better idea here. This red block here, this red block here, both didn't receive bids, but a lot of the other ones did. And so this is a pretty decent forecast. To give you a better general idea of the accuracy of how we've been doing. In the report, you'll always see the most recent years. So right now you can see it's at 2020. And so that'll, as time goes on, we'll get more and more data. And so bump off always the lowest, so you can see the most accurate or most recent. The dark color would be the percentage that happens in that immediate sale. And then the hatched colors are the what happens in the next 3 years. And so the idea being is if we mark a block in the A category and it doesn't receive a bid, well, it doesn't necessarily mean it was a bad block and the forecast was bad, because companies are limited by how much money they have and things like that and planning. And just because a block didn't receive a bid immediately doesn't necessarily mean it's not a good block to bid on. And so some of these get picked up in subsequent sales. So we keep track of that for the next 3 years. And so sometimes additional ones get picked up. And so we want to take that into account. And that's what you're seeing in the hatching. And so, in 2013, it wasn't terrible, wasn't great, but we almost got to 50%, So if we say it's going to be very likely it's going to be bid, we're getting close to 50%. 2015, 16, 17, even a little bit. Those sales were in a very difficult time, and so we didn't do so good. Strange things were happening, so it doesn't make it's not that surprising that our forecast was not that great. But the good news is our accuracy's been going up and up and up recently. So 2018, 19, and 2020 we're all breaking 50% on our red group, and then getting pretty close up to over 25%, definitely over 25% in the B group, which is really good. So as I was saying, is if we give you something that's red, over half of those blocks are going to receive a bid. So that's pretty accurate considering that there's thousands of possible blocks to bid on. We're narrowing it down pretty sharply to just a few key ones. So that's for bid, no bid. The bid amount works in a very similar way. We use the same variables as the bid, no bid model for the most part. All the global variables and things like that are the same. But the company-specific variables, we drop all those because we're not making company-specific bid models. We make one individual bid amount model for the whole thing. So we're really forecasting the high bid amount. The model is multivariate linear instead of logistic. That makes sense if we're trying to forecast an amount. So that's what we use that model. And then the one big problem we've noticed with this is that there are some outliers, and our model is not able to capture that, and we'll go over some examples of that later. The training period and things like that is still the same. You get to select it. It will require at least 3 years. We do allow you to enter the price of oil. So if you want to make a forecast, you're making it out maybe pretty far out in the future, you can enter what you think the price of oil will be, because that does play a big role in bid amounts. And then what we do is we forecast the high bid amount for every open block, same blocks as the bid, no bid. So here is what the output of that would look like. Again, the blue in this case would be the blocks that we think aren't going to receive very high bids, and that's the majority of the blocks. And then the red would be the ones we think will have the highest bids. You notice sometimes there is some correlation here. The blocks that we think are very likely to receive bids generally are the ones we also think will be most expensive, but there isn't a complete correlation. There are some interesting differences that come out of that. So zooming in, we can see some specific examples here. This is in millions of dollars. So here we forecasted, $923,000, and then the actual bid was $1.1 million. So pretty close, and then this guy's pretty close. All these other little blue ones, we forecasted the minimum legal bid, and then the actual bids were just a little bit over on that minimum, and that's a pretty common occurrence actually. People don't want to get too close to that minimum legal bid, just in case the government bumps it up just a little bit. So they usually play it a little safe here. On higher forecasts, so some of the blocks that we are over, is over $2 million, but $2.2 million, came out about 1.8. That's not bad, it's pretty close. And then this one's 2.2, and it came out at 3.1. So this MC683, we were slightly above the actual forecast, and this one we were slightly below, but coming out pretty close. So if you were thinking about bidding 1.8 and you said 2.2, means you're in the ballpark and you haven't missed anything too crazy. Neither have we. Overall, year over year, this is going to be the comparison between our forecast and the actual. So the red here is our forecast and the blue is the actual. So if you look year over year, the one major thing to first notice is that our central tendency is pretty close to the actual central tendency. It means our average bid amounts are about right on, so nothing too crazy is happening there. The other major thing to notice is that our range is generally a lot smaller than the actual range. So, in 2019 here, these were our tip-top outliers. Then the actual outliers got significantly higher than that. This is on a log scale, so this stretches out really far here, actually. And that's the biggest problem with this. That's the one thing you should keep in mind is that any block that's going to receive a abnormally large bid, we're not going to pick up by this. So please keep that in mind, and note that if we forecast $2 million, we think it's going to be $2 million. It doesn't mean that the company who really has done a lot of work on that particular block and really believes in that block and really wants that block pretty much no matter what may come out with a very large bid. So we can look at some examples here in one little area here in Green Canyon. These two blocks we were pretty close to the actual bid amounts. These two blocks we were a little further off. These are higher estimates, so it's okay to be a little bit further off, but nothing too crazy. And then this block, we estimated about 1.7 million, and it came out to be actually over 18 million. So we were off by $16.7 million, and that's because that bid was just very, very large. It's interesting when it happens, and it's very hard for a model to pick out, especially when it's right next to another block that received almost the minimum legal bid. In this particular block, I think we looked up the numbers. Shell, this had many bids. Shell bid 1.6 million. We, ESA, estimated it at 1.7 million, so we were actually pretty close to what Shell came up with. Chevron went a little bit higher than Bohm came up with their MROV as 3.6 million, so even higher than all that. And then Hess said, I really want that block, basically no matter what, bid a very large amount and got it. And I'm sure they did the economic analysis to determine that they would eventually make that money up on this block. That is the bid, no bid, and bid amount. The next part is on rejection, so the MROV. Not too many, but some, between 5 and 7% about of the bids are rejected by the government as being too low. The government tends to raise the MROV near established production. That's because they're worth more, and their goal is to make the MROV amount is something that to pretty much keep the companies honest and to kind of maximize how much money they're able to get fairly from these blocks. Most of the blocks out in the frontier are just set at the minimum legal bid, and that's because there's not as much exploration out there, so the government also has less data to work with, and they're not going to set something significantly above the minimum MRV unless they're sure it is worth more money. So here we took two different approaches, like I said earlier. One was we're trying to forecast the probability that a block does receive the minimum legal MRV, and that's just because so many come out that way, so we can say, okay, a lot of these are going to just be minimum. What's the odds that it is a minimum? And then if it's not a minimum, what actually will that MRV be? That's a little bit more difficult to forecast, but we do make a pretty good job of it. This uses a very different statistical approach. Decision trees and random forest is the heart of it. And that's, we're not going to go too deep into it, but if you look up random forest and decision trees, it's much more closely, we believe, how the internal logic government is doing. Based on what's out there, they keep a lot of it hidden from you. They don't want you to obviously game the system there. But based on the publicly available data, their internal logic tends to follow something that's similar-ish to a random forest. So we want to keep as close as what they're doing as possible. It's a quick example of what a single decision tree looks like. And it's basically just a series of decisions until you arrive at your conclusion. And, at the very top, you say, was the block rejected last time? If it was, we're going to say, well, if it was rejected last time, there's basically a 0% chance that it's going to be rejected in this next uptime. For the minimum MRV, it will be a minimum MRV. It's probably not going to be a minimum MRV is what that means. Well, never happens. That makes perfect sense. Now, if it wasn't rejected last time, and that's the vast majority of blocks that are being bid on, we have to ask ourselves additional questions, and you can say, okay, was it unleased for more than 3 years? No. Is it next to more than one current lease? Yes. So we would say, oh, okay, well, in that particular case, 70% of the time, it ends up being the minimum legal bid. Now, this is one decision tree. A random forest, as the name implies, is made up of several decision trees. In our case, it's actually 500 decision trees. And there's a little bit of randomness and things like that involved. That's why it's a statistical model. And again, I'd recommend you look up random forest if you want to know more about how all that works. So the variables that we supply our random forest would be the distance to the nearest platform, how many years has it been unleased, is it a first time available, what's the average MRVs in the nearby about 2 blocks radius, has it been relinquished, how many current leases are in the area, what's the most recent MRV, what's the EUR nearby field, was it previously rejected, how many discoveries are there, and the change in the MRV. So frequently the government, if it's rejected, they make an MRV and it's rejected, they tend to lower the MRV a little bit year over year. And so how fast is the government change, basically usually reducing that MRV. Example of the output, another map. Blue would be the blocks that we'd say are likely to be minimum. So you don't need to bid too much if you're just trying to beat the government. And then the red would be the ones that are likely to not be the minimum. So you can zoom in and look at the actual amounts here. So really, if you're not worried about competition amongst other companies, you really are worried just about beating the government MRV amount. And you ideally want to beat it by as little as possible to save as much money. And so here's the bid. Someone bid 958. We forecasted pretty close to that. We bid just a little bit above that. That's probably pretty good. And again, it doesn't always happen. Sometimes like that. So, but all these cases here, every bid is beating what we would forecast as the MRV. And that means nothing too crazy is happening, and you're very likely to win all these from the government anyways. If you bid below what we forecast as the MRV, again, what we've done is we've looked at general statistical trends, and this is what we've come up with. And if you disagree, that's fine. You've, as an individual and expert knowledge, have done a lot of, analyze a particular block more than we have, certainly. But this should key you in, and that's the idea, is we want to give you the information and say, hey, this looks like, from public standpoint, a over $1 million MROV block. Perhaps you should reconsider. If you don't think the block is going to be worth that much, you don't want to bid on much. But just you should keep in mind you may lose this block out. The government may reject it. And some other examples. These are ones where it looks like someone on this block bid significantly over our forecasted MRV. So if you're just trying to beat the government, that's a pretty high bid. Maybe you think there's going to be competition, so that's why you want to bid that much. Take a look at our error. Again, the red in this case would be the ones that we think are very likely to be minimums, between 90 and 100%. And then you can see on the y-axis here, it says actual minimum. And so if we think it's very likely to be minimum, it is good that many of them actually are minimum. So that's great, near 100%, and that's in our highest cohort. And then obviously our trend is going down, down, down. So as we think it's less likely to be minimum, it is in fact becoming less likely to be minimum. So that's all great, everything trending in the right direction. The one trouble is that there are so many minimum MROV blocks that the split is very in favor of them being minimum, and that actually presents a bit of a statistical problem, makes it a little difficult to forecast. And that's why in this lowest cohort, you say we have about 0 to 30% chance of being minimum. So on average, we'd say, okay, it's probably about 15% of these should become actually minimum, but we're still, close to the 30% range. So we're over it, or we're above. And that's, like I said, generally because there's so many minimum. So for the MROV amount, here is a little histogram of our errors. This is the actual MROV minus the ESA forecasted MROV. So if we're out here at the $20 million range or $10 million, that means that the actual MROV came out to be a lot higher than what we forecasted. This is a very similar problem to the bid amounts in that sometimes the government also comes out with a really high MROV amount, something much higher than we anticipated. And those outliers are very hard to come up with. It's probably because the government and the company providing it has some kind of particular information on that block. They see something that looks very valuable, and we don't get access to that information, so we miss it. So that's, again, something that happens occasionally. And you can see, generally it doesn't happen on the other side, where what we estimate as the MRV is very, very a lot higher than the actual MRV. We'll zoom in a little bit here because it's so hard. Most of the data is focused right around here at 0, so zoom in at 0 here. This is the negative 1 million error to the positive 1 and 2 million error. And so again, this over here would mean the actual MRV was $2 million more than what we estimated. And then this would be the MRV was very close to what we estimated. That's by far what's most likely to happen. So to just summarize here, we make a forecast for bid, no bid. That would be the likelihood that a block receives a bid, the bid amount, the likelihood that a minimum, that block will have a minimum MROV, and then the MROV amount. This uses publicly available information, so there's nothing particular or especially, if a company has private information, we don't have access to that, so we don't use that. And so that's why, again, we view this model as an additional set of information for you, not something in lieu of what you already are doing as a company. Just extra information that you can compare it to what you've already done, and hopefully it'll clue you in that you may be missing something, or you possibly have a way to save some money by maybe making a lower bid, or maybe you want to, you're a little, it looks a little too close, so you might want to actually increase your bid to guarantee you get the block. We use purely statistical models, so there's no bias or anything like that we're putting in as ourselves, right? There's no expert knowledge that we're tweaking the model by. It's just purely by the statistics. So for the bid, no bid, and bid amount, we're using those standard statistical models. You get confidence intervals, so you can see the spread of the bid amounts, and the likelihood, so, we say, oh, it's a 0.5% chance to be bid. That's a lot different than saying, oh, between 0.4 and 0.6 and 0.2 and 0.8. Even though they're both average out to the same, you would want to know, okay, exactly where that goes. And then also for the bid, no bid, you get models for individual companies. So you can see which you can say, oh, Shell is likely to bid on this one, but Hess is likely to bid over here, things like that. So you can have an idea of why we think this particular block and who is contributing to it to bid on it. We give you everything. The full model specification is supplied. If you really want it, and you could use this to calculate the probabilities yourself. You can tweak it if you wanted to. If you really want to go that far. It's really for validation to make sure we're not doing anything funny. It's just a statistical model is what we're giving you. We also recently added the forecast for blocks that actually already are leased or just not available for other reasons. This would be so people want to know, okay, if this block comes on eventually, what would it be worth? Is it a valuable block? Is it not a valuable block? Interesting way to look at it and compare blocks that aren't available actually for being bid. You can actually see the same information. So this concludes the deeper dive into the bid no bid. If you'd like to see just a briefer general overview of how to use the tool, where to access it in Calm Smart, and just what the report looks like and things like that, we'll have a link in the description. Thank you for watching.